So let's see if we can get through this chapter 7 on movement. Let's move through movement. It's pretty self-explanatory in terms of how the book is laid out and the chapters are chapters prepared for you. But in terms of you organizing your notes, we'll kind of break it down. We'll talk about muscles, cortex, cerebellum, Basal Ganglia, Spinal Cord. All those are different parts that help us out with movement. So look at your notes, we'll look at break it down from that perspective. So when you think about movement, there's something internally happening to make you do all that. So on the front end, you think about muscles, 3 types of muscles to remember: cardiac, smooth, and striated muscle. Cardiac, smooth, or cardiac would really be like heart muscle. Smooth would be your internal digestive system. If you ever had chitlins, or that's like the guts. Skeletal muscle, that's the stick part on the outside. All those are different types, and the one that's probably thickest is the cardiac muscle. It has to beat all the time. No heart beating, not a good thing. So different shapes of the muscles in terms of the striations and the patterns. But again, cardiac, smooth, and striated. Cardiac, smooth, and striated. Striated muscle is skeletal muscle. Now, for the brain, which is the command center to talk to the muscles, there's something called a neuromuscular junction. At the neuromuscular junction, this is the place where the nerve innervates the muscle. So, nerve, muscle. So the neuromuscular junction is just that part where the nerve talks to muscle. So muscle. Bone, tendon, things that are connecting the muscle to the body, but the neuromuscular junction is the site. The chemical that's important where the neuromuscular junction is called acetylcholine. That's the neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction. That if it's not working, if acetylcholine is not talking to receptors, there's no movement. There's some people who could have a problem with the receptors that receive acetylcholine. The disease could be called myasthenia gravis. It's a disorder where there's no receptors and the person feels paralyzed. Not a good thing. So the neuromuscular junction becomes very important, critical for the brain to talk to the body. Muscles are the first point of discussion. That's what I just drew. You can look at your image there. Muscles work by antagonistic function, meaning that you can have muscles, top, bicep, tricep, they work in antagonistic function. One can be extending, one flexing. So you have extensors and flexors. So one straightens, one shrinks. Same thing I just described to you. So you got bicep, tricep. On your legs, you got hamstring, quadricep. So in muscles, there's some people that have fast twitch fibers, some people have slow twitch fibers. Fast twitch happen real quick and they're fast acting, quick acceleration. Slow twitch, slow and durable. Some people are sprinters, some people are long distance runners. The fibers in the muscles may dictate that. Some people have varying percentages of those, and some people can do both. That's why there's middle distance runners, long, short, and middle distance. If you kind of think about it with animals, think about the fiber systems. There's some animals like fish that swim fast, some slow. They may do it at the same time. You look at like tuna and you look at salmon, and sometimes there's different colored meats. If you look at fresh meat before you cook it, there's different colors of meat because it's different what fibers that's causing it to be moving fast or slow. If you're not eating fish, some people like chicken, so it's poultry. So chickens, they can't really fly. They try to fly. When they try to fly real fast and quick. That's why breast meat is white, different color. Most of the time, chickens just walk around in circles, just walking around. That's why the dark, or the legs, dark meat, different color of meat. So the fibers of the animals also dictate how the animal operates, and it's the same thing with humans. So, terms to remember, some called proprioceptors. These are organelles or organs that help to deal with the body's positioning. So, two to remember, one is called the muscle spindle fiber, one is called the Golgi tendon organ. Well, anyway, muscle spindle fiber deals with stretch. So, stretching the muscle. If you're running and jogging, you don't want to pull a muscle if you're in a race. So you have these proprioceptors that give you a sense of how much stretch is going on in your muscle. So that's muscle spindle fiber. The other one's called a Golgi tendon organ. So another proprioceptor dealing with the body's positioning. Like if you close your eyes and stood on one leg, put your hands out. What's keeping you balanced? Those proprioceptors. Tension. Golgi tendon organ deals with tension. So you're doing curls, and it's too much. You don't want your bone, the muscle ripping off the bone. So tendon. Tendon connects your muscle bone. So you don't want to rip that. So the muscle tension, proprioceptors, make sure you're not going to rip it off, and you know when to stop. They say no pain, no gain, but again, you don't want to do it to the point that now you have real pain and now you're torn the muscle. Not a good thing. So, muscles become in the first discussion as we deal with movement. So, this gives you an example of how they operate, the two proprioceptors we just discussed. Patella tendon reflex, you go to the doctor, you cross your knee and they tell you they hit a little hammer onto your tendon of your knee. And you goes up. That's for them to look at your nervous system reflexivity, how the nervous system is operating. So that is a little loop that goes to the spinal cord back to the muscle. Knee-jerk reflex. So, doesn't give an example there, but if you hit the tendon, it goes to the muscle. No, it goes to the spinal cord, it goes to the muscle, and it makes your leg move. Hit the tendon, spinal cord around the muscle, so it's just reflex. So we have multiple reflexes. We have some that we can't control. Some are ballistic, cannot be changed once initiated. So some people just, with like Tourette syndrome, they can't stop certain body parts from moving unless they have a way to kind of control that mentally, but ballistic movements. Some people think about, babies. There's the, is this here? No. So with reflexes, so with the baby, there's a suckling reflex. If you put something near a baby's mouth, it's going to want to suckle because it's trying to survive, it needs something to eat. There's something called a Babinski reflex on a child's foot. You rub the bottom foot, the toes and the small toes and the big toes should flare out in a different way. So that Babinski reflex is also a way of discussing or finding out what's going on internally with the nervous system. So the suckling reflex or rooting reflex, the Babinski reflex, all at the level of infancy. And then you just think about yawning. Is that a reflex? You just yawn? Is it contagious? So yawning, is that a reflex that happens? So there are things that happen automatically, and then in the brain, you have things that are called like motor programs, central pattern generators, things that happen without you even thinking about it, and that's how these computers work, programs. So a central pattern generator are neural mechanisms in the spinal cord that generate rhythmic patterns. So think about a dog that gets wet and they shake to get the water off the hair, off the body. So there's certain cells in the brain and nervous system that helps it to shake. A bird flapping wings, certain patterns that makes it flap its wings in a certain way. Given that, people have motor programs. I mean, you learn how to ride a bike before, guess what? You don't keep learning how to ride a bike, you know how to ride a bike. You got a program in your brain, in your body about how to do that. So, beyond the issue of movement, cortex is the global command center. Cortex is the outer covering of the brain. The global command center, and the place that we start talking about with the cortex is the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex. Another name for the primary motor cortex is the precentral gyrus. So, brain. There's a dividing line between the frontal and the parietal. The dividing line is called the central sulcus. Right in front of the central sulcus is the precentral gyrus, or the what? Primary motor cortex. It's one in magenta, or like a little red color. Primary motor cortex. Behind it is the primary sensory cortex. We're talking about movement, so we're concerned about this one. Then you have these other areas of the frontal lobe. Supplementary motor cortex, premotor, and prefrontal. I'm not going to ask you in detail about that for the exam, but right now we just want to know that that frontal lobe is not just for intellectual reasoning, it's also for what? Your motor skills, motor abilities. Motor cortex. So just to think about doing movement happens at that stage first. So say planning for movement. So each one of those areas we just discussed has a specific role to play in the sequences of movements. On your primary motor cortex or your primary sensory cortex, your body is laid out in a certain way. So down here could be the abdominal area. Here, over here, way is the toes and genitals. Up here is the elbow forearm. So your body is laid out in something called a homunculus. It's like your body is topographically organized onto your cortex, depending upon how the body part is being used from the brain, how it's stimulating the brain to kind of stimulate movement. So each one of these words right here is the actual body part that it's connected to. So planning can, be fast sequence or slow and deliberate. So premotor cortex, supplementary motor cortex, I'm not going to ask you in detail what they do, but just letting you know that's where this planning comes from. It's very important as a global command center. So there's something called mirror neurons that are deep in the brain, actually in the midbrain, not really in the cortex, but they help to work with the cortex. But the mirror neurons, you could think about, like I say, can you moonwalk? Moonwalk. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Maybe Michael Jackson with high waters and black shoes and white socks, moonwalking across the stage. You're not doing it, you're just thinking about it. Think about a child. You're talking to a child, a little kid, little baby that is, and you make a sound, and the baby makes a sound. You make a certain face, baby makes the face. So that's mirror neurons working. Those cells are actually pigmented, called the red nucleus cells. We won't discuss that right here at the moment, but again, those cells become very integral in terms of how you position yourself to make moves. And that's an example of what I said about what a baby may see. Beyond the cortex, how does it get from the muscles, cortex? Spinal cord. So the spinal cord becomes like a train conducting site to make the pathways connect to the body and the brain. Transitory site. So there's two tract systems in the spinal cord. Remember this. One is called the lateral cortical spinal tract. The other is called the ventral medial tract. I'm trying to make it easy for you to remember, because when we said about the spinal cord and the brain, anything that's dark are neurons. Anything that's light or white tracts fibers. So the spinal cord also has that kind of shape, where the dark cells in the middle of it, on the outside is lighter. There'll be an image to show you, but just kind of visualize that where the dark cells are, if it's in the middle, ventral, medial, middle. Lateral, outside. So lateral cortical spinal are pretty much on the outside. And the other key to remember about the lateral cortical is that it deals with your extremities. Extremities, like your hands, like your feet, like your things that are outside. So it controls them, and that means it must cross. Because you ever heard that term? Left side of the body controls, left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. Well, it crosses over. So from the primary motor cortex here, you can go over here to control this part of the body. It crosses. So the lateral cortical spinal crosses. The ventral medial stays on the same side of the body. It's like more of it deals with the trunk, neck and the trunk part of the body. You don't have two necks, you have two trunks. So the ventral medial then controls the internal part, not the extremities. Two different tract pathways. So this image here shows you how with the lateral it crosses. What's in blue are the fibers. So the place that it crosses is in the medulla. It's called the pyramids. Not pyramids like they're in chemistry. Pyramids as in when you cut the brain, the crossing fibers, it look like triangles. So the pyramids, this side of the body, crosses over here, it goes to the other side of the body, in the spinal cord. If you can see it, all this dark area are cell bodies. Inside there are the tracts. That's why it's lighter in color. It's the same thing with the spinal cord. The areas that are dark are the cell bodies, white tracts. So the cell bodies are where the motor neurons are. Whenever you think about the spinal cord, motor neurons, big, thick ones that are there in the spinal cord, they connect into the muscles. Anybody who has a problem with the motor neurons, not a good thing. Any cut of the spinal cord, not a good thing. So if you look at disorders of the spinal cord, it's kind of hard for you to see visually here, but if you look in the text, it talks about paralysis. When damage to the spinal cord, those motor neurons occur. So you can have a person's paraplegic. That is cut through the spinal cord above the segments attached to the leg, so paraplegic. legs don't work. Quad 4, arms or the legs don't work. Depends upon where the cut is, the spinal cord. Hemiplegic, half the body. Tab dorsalis, that relates to latter stages of syphilis, virus that could cause the motor neurons to be destroyed and cause a problem. Another one is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. You heard about this ALS challenge in the past. It relates to a name of a famous baseball player named Lou Gehrig, baseball player who had this, but it's a problem where the motor neurons are being destroyed in the spinal cord. These are a fatal situation. So amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, we know today that there's some problems with this superoxide dismutase, a certain enzyme in the spinal cord that's causing cells not to work right. So beyond that, we know polio is also a problem that's caused by a virus. And not saying that ALS is caused by a virus, but there are some relationships that people who are always thinking about taking care of other people, physically, their minds may be overactive and causing some of those cells potentially to be problematic. Polio, there's a virus that causes that, and now we have vaccines that can stop polio, therefore they don't have those moving problems, but a whole host of issues can attack that spinal cord. Cerebellum, the backside of the head. Cerebellum is like a little brain. Cerebellum itself has 70 billion neurons. Think about the cerebellum node for fine coordinated movement. That's why it says right here, balance and coordination. So if there was some money right here or something small, if I had a problem with cerebellum, I couldn't pick up that item. So it deals with fine coordinated movement. So cerebellum is structured in a very unique way. It has these Purkinje fibers, Mossy fibers, these different structures. I won't get too deeply into that, but just looking at the way that it's constructed, it's like flowers, like cauliflower, like cells that go everywhere. And so it may be really integral and beyond just fine coordinated movement, but also the learning. And we talked a little bit about that in the learning, in the chapter on learning. Moving on to the basal ganglia, this becomes important because the basal ganglia are subcortical structures that operate together to help out with regulating movements. Cortex, global command center, spinal cord transition site, of course muscles connected to bones and make you move, but the basal ganglia in the brain helps you to regulate all that. So some important structures, cardiac nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, how they work together, not one by themselves, but together with certain chemicals that are being emitted, controls and regulation movements. So we look at the brain, and you look at the basal ganglia, when I say subcortical, all below the cortex. All these colored areas are what we blow it up. Places is it. Cardiac nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, and you add to this substantia nigra and subthalamic nucleus. Substantia nigra, substance, black substance. Talk about that because there's a disorder that happens if that area is not working right. So it gets kind of complex in terms of connections. Remember that there's a very important chemical involved in this called dopamine. And you note dopamine, two different pathways that can have an impact. One is on the nigrostriatal system, because it's going from the substantia nigra to the cardiac nucleus. Another name for the cardiac nucleus is the striatum. This area is for movement. Dopamine. There's another pathway called the mesolimbic pathway. That's going from the middle part of the brain to the frontal part in a place called the nucleus accumbens. What you need to remember is that it's also dopamine. And it's a affecting emotions. So movement and emotions are both impacted by dopamine, two different systems. So that's why music and rhythm becomes very important to certain realities. So here we are. When you look at this, just understand that you got the dynamic of understanding the way that the brain is connected. Any disruption in any of those pathways, you're going to have a problem with how it is actually producing or interfering with behavior. So don't worry about this issue about conscious decision making, but as we move on to talk about disorders, brain disorders such as Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. If that basal ganglia is destroyed and not working right, these disorders can happen. So what is Parkinson's disease? It's a disease manifested by slow movements, shuffling of the feet, fascination. The person is walking, they can't initiate a movement. You tell them to do something, they can't actually do it. Why is that basal ganglia being destroyed? What areas are being disturbed? Primarily, it's the substantia nigra. So gradual loss of those cells in the substance black melanin, neuromelanin in the brain. Something's causing it to destroy it. Don't have time to go too deeply into it, but the reality is that those cells also send dopamine releasing axons to another part of the brain. So if there's no dopamine, no black cells, guess what? Movement's back. But imagine it worked right. You probably moonwalk, do all kinds of dances, psychomotor skills. So it becomes very important for that area to work right. So in Parkinson's disease, dopamine is being decreased, those cells are dying out. So it could be a neurotoxic situation, something causing. Could be genetic. Could be lifestyle. So it's kind of complex to prescribe, but you can look at the slides and see the areas that are disturbed. So certainly say it could be a genetic link. So beyond the issue of, like I said, food neurotoxins, could be what? Traumatic head injury, hitting the head, that destroys those cells over time. Key here, pesticides. That's why it's important to wash the fruits, wash the vegetables. People who work around insecticides, pesticides over time, that stuff gets in your body. Melanin serves as an antioxidant. It's absorbing toxic things. So over time, if it's taking on too much toxicity, destroys those cells. Cigarette smoking. It's interesting that cigarette smoking and coffee seem to help decrease some of the symptoms. I don't know how that works. Caffeine and nicotine, but somehow in the long run may help some people. So treatments, the chemical pathways that make dopamine, phenylalanine, to tyrosine, to L-dopa, to dopamine. So if you give those chemicals that are before, hey, do you help out to make dopamine? Well, L-dopa treatment has been provided, but it's not as effective. It can present some unpleasant side effects, so that's not really good. But some ways to boost those chemicals are what are being done. There's some drugs that are being created that can help out, but essentially those cells are dying out. There is no medical treatment for that. There are some people that have surgery. You can have actually, let's say, an implant of an electrical device that when you feel the tremors going on, people with Parkinson's disease, they can't control the muscles, can't stop that. Push a button, goes to the brain, and it shuts down those tremors. That's invasive, but it can help some. There's also something called fetal transplant surgery, stem cell research. Stem cell, taking the cells from a growing fetus or some cells that are continually growing, put them in the brain to then make those cells that have been dying out. So you see why stem cell research has been controversial, because where are you getting those cells from? So for treatments, again, antioxidants, food items, berries, things that contain elements that can clean cells out are important. So Huntington's disease is you don't usually think of Parkinson's as fatal. It can be debilitating in terms of lifestyle, but Huntington's disease is fatal. It's a dominantly transmitted disease. When we say dominant, it could be dominant, recessive, or sex-linked diseases. Dominant. You got the gene for it, associated with gradual extensive brain damage, especially in the basal ganglia, but also in the cerebral cortex. So many of these studies came out of cohorts of people living in certain areas who are always getting this. What's going on with the genes? So it's found out that a certain chromosome, I believe it's chromosome 4. Yep, chromosome 4. So for some reason, it's not just impairments in movement. It used to be called Huntington's chorea, C-H-O-R-E-A. That sounds like choreography, because the person, they couldn't control the movements, so it was almost like they were doing choreography. So it used to be called Huntington's chorea, because it didn't just really destroy the movement or impact movement, it also made the person feel depressed, memory impairments, poor judgment issues. Issue is that it's fatal. It's like 35, he's 35 onset. 30 to 50 years old, I mean, by the end of that, it's pretty much your body and brain deteriorate. So that's what the brain will look like. Huntington's disease, normal brain, this is deteriorating. It's like something beaten up. So physically, something called on chromosome 4, it's producing too much of a DNA sequence called cytosine adenine guanine. For some reason, CAG is replicated too many times, and this chromosome causing that makes it destroy those cells. So we do know it's genetic, and so there's a gene called Huntington's led to the discovery of this protein that codes it called Huntington, and this mutant form impairs neurons in the brain. So future drug therapy could potentially find out ways to alter that, but essentially Huntington's disease is a fatal movement disorder. So in conclusion, as long as you know those different aspects of movement, like I said about the cortex, muscles, spinal cord, basal ganglia, cerebellum, you're fine. Study hard.